Shalom Aleichem. Today's still Sunday, and it's still Ches Yom L'Chedesh Nisan, the 8th day in the month of Nisan. It's the Nasi of Bnei Menashe. And as I'm sure you're aware, it says in that Yom even, that we say all 12 Nasiim and all 12 Yeratzins if we know what Shevet we belong to, or if we know for sure we don't belong to a particular Shevet. Because of Iber Neshamas and Gilgal Neshamas, that's why Koyanim, the Friedrich Rebbe at Edom was a Koyan, Nachmedel Koyan, and he asked about saying the Yeratzins. And the Friedrich Rebbe says you say all the Yeratzins with all the names of the Shvatim because of Gilgal and Iber Neshamas. But before we start to learn, I need to mention that the Shir is Chus for the Fuah Shleim of Meir, Chayim, and Chayet Tzira, and Liebe Breiner Bas Alta Miriam, and Shlem Yosef and Risha, Chayim Mushka Bas Natala, Vegal Bas Bela, Zissel Bas and Yechashe, Zahara Ariella Bas Mazeltov, and Shoshana Teva Bas Leah. It is Chus for Lil Nishmas for HaKodeš, Tzvi ben Alexander HaKoyen, Hashem Yimkim Domei, and Meish Yehuda ben Tzvi Yosef. It's also Chus for Zara Chayva Kayama, for Chaya Bas Reis and Yisrael Shem and Ben Ed. Now, Rabbi said, this is our second class on the Kapital, the Perek Kuf Chav Daled of the Rebbe's. Earlier today, I gave an overview class where I read the Kapital inside and I translated it Bepashtus. And then I gave you an overview of the various different opinions, beginning with the Chazal, the Zayir, and the Medesh, and then the Rishonim and some Achreinim, as to when this Kapital was said. It was written by David HaMelech. And according to the Zayir and the Medrash, it was said by Yankov Avinu. And recorded in the Tilim, Nimes Miras Yisrael, of David, who was the Nimes Miras Yisrael. Hundreds of years after Yankov Avinu said it when he was in Lavan's house. And he said it for Bnei Yisrael B'Goyla. Either he said it for the Yidden going into Golas, or he said it for the Yidden during the Golas, or for Yidden when they're coming out of the Golas. And he's medaktik, and it says, I think in the Chidah, one of the Pirushim, Shiramas the David, that he hoped that when Yidden would be in the condition to sing this psalm, they would remember him. And remembering him would be a sign that they're singing the psalm with proper betochen, proper emunah, with a good attitude in their relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, Rabbi say, my plan, of course, is to teach the Kapital pasuk by pasuk, and to develop a pirush based on the various mafashim that we've been reading. But this class is still not yet the text of the Perek. In this class, I want to talk about a few ideas that this Kapital includes that deserve our attention by way of Hagdama. And the first is the word Lule, and that's really the dominant discussion that we're going to have in this class. It's based on the Tzemach Tzedek in Yoleid, and there's sichas, several sichas that Rabbi, I believe, where he analyzes and he studies different aspects of what the Tzemach Tzedek writes in this Perek. The Tzemach Tzedek compares the word Lule to the word Elul. And he makes the following observation, that when it comes to the word Elul, we know from all kinds of examples from the Chazal that there's a variety, there's more than one or two, krivs and ksivs on the word Loi, like the word Asher Loi Choyma. You could spell it Lamed Vav, you could spell it Lamed Aleph. And there's a whole series of cases in the Torah where you have Loi, and it's written with a Vav, which means to him, and it's spelled with an Aleph, which means not, or vice versa, that it's written Loi, and it means no, but it's spelled Lamed Vav, and these are two opposite ideas, Loi with a Vav and Loi with an Aleph. And there's a lot of discussion, I see this, about this interface of Loi and Loi. Now the classic, this is like, it's a classic idea. This is not unusual, this idea which is discussed at Chassidus at length. What's the difference between Loi with a Vav and Loi with an Aleph? So in Kabbalah language, Loi with a Vav is Zah, and Loi with an Aleph is Keser, and specifically it's Atika Kadisha. And that's why you have so many words that they're written one way and they're understood a different way. Because in Torah, there are ideas which exist on two levels. They exist on a level of Ishtalshalos, in which case the Loi would be with a Vav, and they exist on a level which is above Ishtalshus, in which case the lay would be with an aleph. And Elo, loy, connotes ideas that include both levels. The lower level, that means godliness as it exists in Ishtalshus, and the higher level of godliness that exists in Atzmas Ein Seif. The example that Tzemach Tzedek brings is Kikel Deis Havai V'Lei Niskenu Alilis. It's a pasuk in Shmuel. That the Eibush is Kel Deis, a lakus of two deis, and of course there's so much Chassidus in these two deis, Das Elyon and Das Tachten, and it's discussed in so many places in Chassidus. And there's V'Lei Niskenu Alilis, and V'Lei means to him, with Niskenu was prepared Alilis, schemes, but it's written with an aleph, which means there is no Alilis in relationship with the Eibush, but it's the key is it's read and translated as if to him is prepared Alilis. This is a wonderful example of this model where there are a variety of words that are spelled Lamed Loy, it's pronounced Loy, and sometimes it's written with Lamed Vav and it's understood to be Lamed Aleph, and sometimes it's written Lamed Aleph and it's understood to be Lamed Vav. And in Chassidus and Kabbalah will always explain to you that Loy mit Avav, Loy with a Vav connotes him as he comes into Ishtalshus. The letter Vav goes on the 6 midas, which is basically the Eid Ampin, so of Atzilus. Godliness in a form of Adam. And Loy with an Aleph goes in Keser and goes specifically on Pnimiyas HaKeser. So let me talk a little bit about what's the difference between Loy with a Vav and Loy with an Aleph, and as it ties into Elul. And then we're going to disconnect that to Lulei. The Rebbe holds that the Yud of Lulei, that Tzemach Tzedek says, of course, is very similar to the Aleph of Elul, Lulei He'amanti, Lilus B'tuva D'Shem Be'eretz HaChaim, like it says in the Shemedi. In Chassidus, they discuss the relationship between the Eibishter and the world. And to start from the lowest level, Chassidus discusses that there is no relationship between the Eibishter and the world. It is only that the Eibishter, to say a Yiddish expression, Shtelzechos and Seder Ishtalshus, arranges himself within the form of Ishtalshus, the chain reaction of worlds. Or to say it in the language of Kabbalah, he's mitzamtzim himself, he contracts himself in the bechin of Adam. Adam means kavim yamin smel emtza reish techseif, a partzuf of Adam, which is the way godliness comes into a form which is limited and complex, and that's a whole discussion how godliness can be in that situation. And the way godliness comes out into the bechin of Adam, like you have in Tanya Perek Daled, and of course it's brought in Chassidus as well, that Adam Ha'elyon and Adam Ha'tachten have a relationship like Adam to Adam. Atzilus is called Adam Ha'elyon, the human being down here is called Adam Ha'tachten, the lower man, the man below, and between Adam and Adam there's a relationship, like one human being with another Kvayochel. And that's the pshat in the pasuk. Kamayim upon him can leave Adam al-Adam. Adam Ha'elyon and Adam Ha'tachten have an interface. So the way the Eibishter Kvayochel, the way Eibishter godliness Kvayochel, takes on the gvul, the tziyud of Adam, there's a relationship between him and us. And of course, this Adam Ha'elyon is responsible for creation. That's where we're created in his image. And this Adam Ha'elyon is responsible for Torah, which is why our purpose is in the image of Adam. Zeis HaTorah, Adam, Torah, Shtelzechos, Torah is also arranged in Adam. That's why Torah is reasonable, is connected to the Ramach Evidim, Ramach Pikudin, Inin Ramach Evidim, the Malka, and so on and so forth. And the way you would explain that philosophically is that since according to Kabbalah there's a lakus, and since according to Kabbalah there's a lakus via Shtelzechos in the Tzuras Adam, the godliness is manifest in the form of Adam, there is a reasonable, there's a measurable, there's an erech relatedness between the human being down here and Adam of Atzilus. And in plain words, that our connection to Hashem makes sense. It's logical. Our actions create a reaction from on high. The Eibishter's reactions from on high, Kvayachal, create a reaction from within us. Like a human being interfaces with another human being, although this is Adam HaTachten and this is Adam Ha'elyon and there's Varech of Efer, there's no similarity between the two Adams whatsoever, but still, this is Adam and this is Adam. And on this level, the relationship with the Eibishter and the world is reasonable and limited and logical. So to use Yankov and Esav as an example, you would say, Oyev is Yankov and Esav and Eibishter loves Yankov and hates Esav. On this level, the reason he loves Yankov is because Yankov is worthy of his love. Yankov behaves. Yankov's a good person. Yankov's a righteous person. Yankov lives according to The Tzelem Elokim. He lives his life and refines himself to be in the image of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he's therefore worthy of the Eibishter's reciprocity from Adam HaElyon to Adam HaTachton. And Esav is a Rosh. Esav violates the laws, even though Esav has incredible powers, and mystically he may have a higher sherish than Yankov Avinu, but the fact is that he's violating the rules, he's not behaving the way the Eibishter wishes, and therefore the law of which the Eibishter has to Yankov is reasonable and true, and this love, the opposite of love, which Eibishter feels at his disposal towards Esav, is also reasonable and measured and limited. So it's all very reasonable. It makes sense. If Esav becomes a tzaddik, the Eibishter will love him, and it goes both ways. That's the first level. Then the second level is called Arich, or Chitzenius HaKesed, or the Lashon, which is based on the Pasuk, based on the Chazal, a level where darkness is like light. And the concept is that Ein Sof is infinite. And Ein Sof, which is infinite, is also called Igulim, which means it's in the shape of a circle, which is called Katnas. Infinity has a lack of form, lack of detail. And its infinity is therefore immature, underdeveloped. It's infinite, there's no limit, but also has no direction and no purpose. This is called Chitzenius HaMakif. It's above Hishtalshlus, it's above the level of reason where Adam and Adam HaTachton, Adam HaElyon, Adam HaTachton interface in a way that's reasonable. But on the level of Chitzenius HaKesed, there's no difference between the Tzaddik and the Rasha. There's no difference between Yankov and Esav. He doesn't love Yankov, doesn't hate Esav, he's indifferent to it all. Ein Sof either cares about nothing or cares about everything, because there's no proper judgment. The biggest tzaddik is not a tzaddik, and the biggest rasha is not a rasha. On the level of Chitzenius HaMakif, all things are equal. And on this madrega, it says in Chassidus that Klipa can draw life, what's called from Makif HaElyon, from Ein Sof, which is above Hishtalshlus. And it explains lofty Klipas. And just to give an example, which is connected to Pesach, which is going to be upon us in a few days, or in 1 week to be precise, Pare is this madrege. It's Pari Menei called Nehed and Elon. Pare comes to very high madrege in Kesed. But Pare of Klipa is Oiref. It's the back of these high madreges in Kesed. It's Ein Sof, but it's Ein Sof without a spearhead. It's Ein Sof without a direction. And since on that level there is no discrimination, there is no sense of right and wrong and good and evil, everything is equal, and Klipa can grow chayas from there as well. This is called Chitzenius HaMakif. But then there's a third level, which is called Pnimius HaMakif, or Atika Kadisha. And the Lashon, which is brought from the Zayar and the Kuntas of Mayan, and the B'kama Mekemes, is Lahasam Le'ela Mata Aksa Di Yisrael, that even though on the level of Chitzenius HaMakif, which is lower, Klayachol, all things are equal, nothing matters, nothing makes a difference. But on the Madrega, Pnimius HaMakif, Lahasam Le'ela Mata, over there on this even higher level, the Aksa, the pain of the Jewish people reaches. But Chassidus says, the only reason Aksa Yisrael, the pain of the Jewish people, reaches Pnimius HaKesed is not because Yidden are tzaddikim, and the Eibishter feels their pain based on their righteousness, but rather for an entirely different reason. And going back to the metaphor of Yankov and Esav again, on this level it's brought in Chassidus, Esav Yankov. There's a place where Yankov and Esav are brothers. The Rishas of Esav, the Tzidkas of Yankov, are insignificant next to the Ein Sof, the Pnimius HaMakif, and because they're insignificant next to the Ein Sof, they could sit next to one another. Esav is not a Rosh, and Yankov is not a Tzaddik. And nevertheless, V'oyev es Yankov es Esav Sanesi, Hashem says, I love Yankov and I hate Esav. Now, how could those two things both be true? On the one hand, Yankov and Esav are equal, on the other hand, he loves Yankov and hates Esav. And the answer, of course, is Ata v'chatonu mikol ha'amim. On this level, the Eibishter chooses Kedusha, Dein hanyan lei, dein lei hanyan lei, and he dischooses, he doesn't choose. Liuma doesn't choose Klipa, but not because he sees the merits in Kedusha, or the demerits in Klipa, but because this is his bechira, this is his choice. Or to use a Purim de Kalash, it's a niyyah from Geidel, on a level which is altogether beyond any kind of reason. You know, even though Lo Yoda, you don't understand logically why Mordechai is Baruch and Haman is Adar, still you say Baruch Mordechai and Adar Haman. But you're not saying Baruch Mordechai because of Mordechai's tzidkes. You're not saying Adar Haman because of Haman's rishis. You're saying Baruch Mordechai and Adar Haman because they made that bechira. Hashem decided. And this is the highest level. And on this level, on the one hand, Kedusha and Klipa are exactly equal. On the other hand, the Eibishter's choice in Klipa. and his disdain for the choice in Kedusha, and his disdain for Klipa is mamish and efen abligvo. It's called atzmi. His preference for Kedusha is not based on the advantages of Kedusha, but this is his choice. His not preferring dein lei hanyan lei of Klipa is not because of what's wrong with Klipa, because this is his choice. And that's the Kabbalah behind the word lei and lei. Lei with a vav is atzilus, and lei with an aleph is pnimius akes. In other words, the middle level is not in the conversation. The first level is, and the third level is. In the word Elul, Lamed Vav means how godliness, or the word Lule Hamanti, at the end of the Shamedi, which is Asis Elul, of course. The Lamed Vav means the way godliness comes to the world, comes close enough to the world in a way that it's sufficiently proximate, that his involvement in the world is a reflection of what's happening in the world, and the world's relationship with him is earned, so to speak. It's a reasonable bonding. And therefore, on this level, there's a dislike for Klipa, because Klipa is taka no good. And then there's Loimet an Aleph, which is Pimius HaKesed. And on this level, the Eibishter loves Kedusha and hates Klipa. But on the level where he loves Kedusha and hates Klipa, it's not because Kedusha is good and Klipa is bad, because this is his choice. And therefore, on the one hand, there's no difference between Kedusha and Klipa. But on the other hand, there is the biggest difference between Kedusha and Klipa, because Kedusha is not being chosen because of what makes it better than Klipa, because that's always limited, and it can always be even better, but this is the Eibishter's choice. And the Eibishter is not choosing Klipa, is not because of the evil of Klipa, because Klipa can always be more evil than it is, but rather this is his Bechira. And that's how Chassidus explains Elul. He says, it's a Machzadik said the same is true with Luli, but you have to replace the Yud with the Aleph with the Yud. It's very similar. That the Vav, Lamed Vav, represents godliness, the way it relates to the world on a reasonable level. And the way it relates to the world on a reasonable level, its involvement within the world is according to the limitations of the world. It's proximate, it's close. The world's behavior and the Eibishter's reactions are reasonable and reciprocal. And then there's a madreg of Loi with a Yud, which is taking the place of Loi with an Aleph. And this is the idea that the relation with Eibush and the world is based on righteousness and evil. There's good and bad, there's tzaddik and rasha, but it's not because of the good of the tzaddik and because of the bad of the rasha, but because of the Eibishter's Bereira. This is what the Tzemach Tzedek says. So we say in this Kapital twice, Lule, Adeshem, Shahaya Lanu, that the reason we get through Golus, which what this Perek is about, because it's Luli Adeshem Shayalonu, because there's Luli Havaya Shayalonu, that the Eibishter's involvement with Yidden is not limited to Loi with a Vav, based on a reasonable involvement with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but it also involves a Loi with an Aleph, which is even higher than that. And of course, this makes a lot of sense, because since this Perek is about celebrating Golus, either celebrating going into Golus, and this can help us survive, or celebrating us while we're still in Golus, but we're seeing the Yad Hashem, including at the worst moment in our history, like it's brought from the Chidah, who quotes the Gemara that at the time is talking about the time of Haman, or you talk when you're not leaving Golus and going into Geulah. In all of these cases, you say, Luli Havai Shayalonu. How do we go into Golus? How do we survive Golus? Because our relationship with the Eibishter is not defined strictly by reason and reciprocity. The Eibishter's relation with the Jewish people is defined by a combination of a reasonable relationship and an absolute relationship. That at moments, the Eibishter reveals the Loi with an Aleph, that his love for the Jewish people is super rational, and that's what we get through the Golus, and that's what brings us to the Golus when we say, as our Perek finishes. Or to use a Purim analogy, that although Purim is a month behind us, we're going to Pesach. But the story of Purim took place mamish in these days, Yud Gimel Nissen, Yud Daled Nissen, Tezvav Nissen, and Tezayin Nissen. The story of Purim is Balaylahu, that the king is asleep, and sleeping goes on the Eibishter, Vayikas Kyashan Adeshem, like it says in the Bar Mitzvah Maimer. And in the middle of his sleep is stirred. Not he woke up. In the middle of his sleep is disturbed. And what does the Eibishter hear? He hears the Tenekah Shel Beis Rabban, the Hevel Tenekah Shel Beis Rabban, learning Torah. And this arouses the Eibishter Kvayachol, and he's in Seder Nichmru Rachma Val Amai, and because of their tshuva, he saves them from the Gezeira of Haman and Rosh. But it works not because of Yidden's chus. They don't deserve it. The Gemara says, the Teitzos that Haman wanted to bring about because of the two Avedas of Nishtachavu L'Tzelem and Nehenu Misudase Shalei Rasha. So why are we saved? We're saved because of Lule, because the Eibish's love, his relationship with us has a level where even if reasonably we're not worthy and not deserving on an Atzmi level, that favoritism is always there. And that's the title, Luli, Adeshem Shahaya Lanu. Luli Adeshem Shahaya Lanu, B'kumaleru Adam, Azai, Azai, Azai. And then we say, after the three Azais, we speak about how the Eibishter saves us. Baruch Adeshem, Shalei Nesanot Tedel L'Sheneim. Nafsheinu Ketzipen Nimel, Tamipachi Yikshim, Apach Neshbav Anach, Nemlot, Nezayin B'Shem Adem Eisish Mayim V'Oretz. We will survive, we are surviving, we have survived the Golus because of Lule. Because the involvement of the Eibishter with us includes a level which is way beyond Seder Ishtalshlus. And the Tzemach Tzedek is medayik further. They say, Lule Havaya Shahaya Lanu. And he says that Lanu is B'Gematria Lekim. Isn't that interesting? Lanu is 86, B'Gematria Lekim. But Lanu means Elikim Shalanu, our God. Or in the Lashon of the Siddur, in the Lashon of the Halacha Lekenu, our personal God. And in many of my classes I point out that it says in Chassidus that there's an extraordinary difference between the word Elikim and the word Elekenu. Because Elikim means the godliness of concealment. And Elekenu means our personal God. God that's proximate to us, God that's so personalized to us as unser God. Or to say it in different words, if Elikim, more than anything else, epitomizes, it denotes concealment, Elekenu epitomizes and denotes personalization. It doesn't necessarily mean that all of Hashem is revealed. There's no such thing. But that He's so presented to us that He's personal to us. Especially when we say Lashon Yochad Elekai, as opposed to Elekenu. So Luli Havai Alonu means that the godliness of Elikus, which is above Ishtalshlus, as represented by the Yud, which takes the place of the Aleph, comes into Havaya, which means Ein Seif, which is often the Elikus of Zoh, and that comes down into Lonu, that the Eibishter is personalized to us. And of course the Chiddush here is that even in the times of Golus, when they say Seinu Leinu Inu, in any Tani Yedei Admo, the Rebbe always misses the middle words. Ein Eid Navi, because the Rebbe who's speaking those words is the Navi. So whenever the Rebbe quoted that pasuk, and he quoted it many, many times, he would say, Seinu Leinu Inu, Ein Eid Tani Yedei Admo, and he would skip the words, Ein Eid Navi. We're time in Golus, everything is Behel and Behester. And the Hel and Behester has many, many bases, including the fact that perhaps we don't deserve Gilui Elikus, but there is the Lule, there is the connection between HaKadosh Baruch Hu and Yidden, which is altogether beyond reason and beyond limitation, that keeps us. And that Elikus, which is beyond limitation, beyond reason, becomes Elikas Shalom, our personal God, which is how Chassidus explains Purim. That what makes Purim so special is that we were saved by the Eibishter, but not by Elikus to Eitzin Ishtalshelus, because the Elikus and Ishtalshelus, which is called Lai B'Tavov, was sleeping. But Elikus of Atika Kadisha, Eina Pkicha, the Leinim, the one eye that never closes, even in the times of Golus, Layonim, Layishin, Shema, Yisrael, the eye of the Eibishter never closes, and He guards Yidden. Not because of their worthiness, not because of their deservedness, not because of their level in Madrega, but because the Eibishter has this absolutely unconditional love for the Jewish people. That's what saved us in the time of Purim. And that's the meaning of the word, Luli Adeshem Shaya Lonu. The Elikus, which is above Ishtalshelus, is personalized for us as individual people. This is the first part of the Tzemach Tzedek's discussion on the word Lule, and there's more to come. But then on this, the Rebbe has a Chiddush Nifle, which I may be misunderstanding. I don't think I'm misunderstanding, but I may be misunderstanding, which makes this idea even crazier than it is by the Tzemach Tzedek. The Rebbe comes along and adds a whole new dimension. And he asks the question, what's the difference between a Yud and an Aleph? Because the Tzemach Tzedek is saying that Lule is the same thing as Lule with an Aleph. And he says that Lamed Vav, Lamed Yud is the same thing as Lamed Vav, Lamed Aleph. But the fact of the matter is that there is a difference between the word Lule with a Yud and Lule with an Aleph. So the Rebbe develops it by saying that the Aleph of Lule or the Aleph of Elul is Anil Deidi V'Deidili. Which means this, that although the Aleph is talking about Pnimis HaKeser, although the Aleph is talking about a Madrege that is so far removed from the world, that Esav and Yankov are the same, And the only reason the Eibishter prefers Yankov over Esav is a inyan from Bechira of Oyev is Yankov as Esav Senesi. But it's altogether above reason. But the very fact that Aleph is Ani Ledoidi shows on a proximity even between the Lakus and the Madrega of Atik and the world. So the Rebbe therefore argues there's two ways that Rebbe spins it, but one of them is that the Yud of Lule is even higher than the Aleph of Lule. Because the Aleph of Lule means the Lakus is removed from the world, but because it's part of the Rosh Teva, Savanila Deidi V'Deidi Li, it has a shaykhis to the world in some indirect way. Like, you have in Chassidus a difference between Pnimis Abba, Pnimis Atik, and Pnimis Atik Meishubim Keme. And it's brought in Sefer HaMaimorim Taf Shin, page 49 and 50 in the long Ha'ara, where the Rebbe says this is called Chagas of Atik, and this is called Chabad of Atik. And that's the difference between Luli with an Aleph and Luli with a Yud. So the Rebbe is saying something here which is unbelievable. That Luli ad Shem Shahaya Lanu is at the level of godliness, which is the reason the Jewish people get through the Golus and survive the Golus and are supported in Golus and elevate the Golus, is not just from Madrega Vatika Kadisha as represented by the Aleph, but it's from Madrega Vatika Kadisha which is represented by the letter Yud, which has no connection to the world at all. Not even in a way where the Eibush lowers himself to be involved in the world. Pnimis Abba, Pnimis Atik, but Kvayachal Alakus as it is mamish by itself, and this Madrega is also available to Yidden in times of Golus. And this is how we survive. Lulia the Shem Shahaya Lanu, which is said twice. Lulia the Shem Shahaya Lanu indicates that the level of Alakus, which is the reason we survive Golus, is from this Madrege, which is Atik, which has no connection to the world whatsoever. This is the Tzemach Tzedek's pshat in the word Lulia the Shem Shahaya Lanu. But the Tzemach Tzedek isn't done. He brings a medrash. And the medrash says that any time it says the word lule, he brings a bunch of lules with a bunch of different Muslim. But he says, anytime it says lule, it goes on the inyan of the Ovis. The Ovis is connected to the word lule. Emuna is connected to the word lule. And Teire is connected to the word lule. Three things are connected to the idea of lule. Ovis, Emuna, and Teire. And he explains everything in two lines. Kedarke b'Kodesh, Tzemach Tzedek in Yalei is very, very bekitzer. There's 2 or 3 lines, or maybe 4 lines explaining the connection between Luli and the Yovis, and 2 lines explaining the connection between Luli and Amuna, and 2 lines connecting the word Luli and the Indian of Teda. And in each of the 3, he makes the same point that we made before. There's godliness in Ishtalshalos, and there's godliness in Atzmos. And most things either relate to Yidden and the world from one level or the other level. These 3 things exist on both levels. The Ovis exists in the Madrege of Atika Kadisha, and there is at the Ovis, Vimizak Stellen Zechais and say that the Shtalshus appear in Ashtalshus that they call the Ovis, Hein Hein Amarkova, which goes on the Midas and Spheres of Atzilus. And the same is true of the Yiddish Emunah. The Emunah by a Yid, on the one hand, is connected to the Madrege Atzmes of Atika Kadisha, and the other hand, the way it comes down into Das. And the same is true of Teira, that Teira is originally Shashua Mavach Batzmusei. Teira is way above Seder Ishtalshalos. And then there's the way Teira, to use a Yiddish expression, Shtel Tzechais, is arranged in Seichel, in understanding, until it comes down to the Madrega of human understanding. Let's talk about each one separately. He talks about the Ovis. And when he talks about the Ovis, he brings the inyan of Kiddush Hashem, Mesiras Nefesh Kiddush Hashem, that Tzemach Tzedek brings. The Mesiras Nefesh Kiddush Hashem. Because the avoid of the Ovis was Mesiras Nefesh, and the avoid of the Ovis was Kiddush Hashem. The way the Ovis lived, they didn't have a Teira. There was a Gzeira between Alyenim and Tachtenim. So for anybody, before Matan Teira, to have a relationship with the Eibishter, there's a requirement to be completely beyond any limits. A reasonable relationship with the Eibishter was not a relationship with the Eibishter, it was a relationship with yourself. Because the Eibishter didn't bring himself close enough to the world to allow for that, to accommodate that, which is what happened at Matan Teira. And the Ovis were before. But the Ovis served Hashem, the Ovis are considered Yidden, because they served the Eibush on a level of Mesiras Nefesh. But the Mesiras Nefesh that the Ovis had was total. That Kol Levareim Kulam, Kol Yemeim Kulam, every minute of the day and night, every one of their limbs and organs and body parts was a merkava only for the Eibishter and became a merkava for nothing else except for the Eibishter, like the story that's brought that the Mezritcher Maggid was trying to take a nap out of Shabbos, and the Aaron Agadol Mikarlin was saying Shir Hashirim, and that the Mezritcher Maggid sent him a message that he should stop saying Shir Hashirim because he's preventing him from sleeping, because from the Aaron Agadol of Karlin, stolen Shir Hashirim is a whole tumul l'mayla. So Shemami in our class, we learn that when a person says Shir Hashirim, the big tumul l'mayla, and that the Aaron Agadol Shir Hashirim was such a powerful thing that it disturbed the Mezritcher Maggid's sleep. But it also teaches us that the Mezritcher Maggid's sleep is more important than the Aaron Agadol Shir Hashirim, because the Mezritcher Maggid was a madrega of a merkava. His sleep was Avodas Hashem. And his sleep was Avodas Hashem on such a high level that a tzaddik gomer, like a Aaron Kalina, has to stop saying Shir Hashirim so the Mezritcher Maggid could do his inyan of sleeping in the time of the mitzvah of Shabbos, like it says in Kabbalah. So those are merkava. They serve Hashem with every fiber of the being, every moment of the day and night, to the extent that their life is considered Mesiras Nefesh, Nefesh HaKiddush Hashem. But like I told you before, on the other hand, the inyan of the Ovis comes on into the Midas of Atzilus. Their life was a life of Mesiras Nefesh. And at the same time, it comes on into order, form. Avraham is Chesed, Yitzchak is Gvur, and Yaakov is Rachamim Tiferes. And that's the combination of Lulei. The Mesiras Nefesh, HaKiddush Hashem is the Lamed Yud, or the Lamed Aleph. And the fact that they're in the Sfiris and the Midas of Atzilus, this is the Lamed Vov. But of course, you have to point out, that was only by the Ovis. That because it's hard to understand how their relationship with the Eibush was at all reasonable. I was thinking when I was preparing, although I'm not sure I believe myself this, that perhaps the aspect of Avodas Ovid which is reasonable was the fact that they were Makarav so many people to the Eibishter. Although the people that were Makarav to the Eibishter stayed connected to the Eibishter, as long as that particular Ov, was Avraham Avinu and his dar, Yitzchak and his dar, and Yankov and his generation were Makarav people. But when they passed away and somebody else changed their place, the people who were Gedim at Avraham Avinu did not carry over to Yitzchak because they were connected to the Midas Shel Avraham Avinu, which is Avraham Avi Chesed. But perhaps that's the pshat that the Oves, on the one hand, because their avoid is Mesiras Nefesh HaKiddush Hashem, total self-sacrifice to the Eibishter, it's connected to Li, Lamed Yud, or Lamed Aleph. But on the other hand, they're connected to the Midas of Atzilus, perhaps in the relationship with the world, and that's the Lamed Vav, but I'm not sure about that. But by us it's different, because we were given the Torah. And the whole idea of Torah is Leila Torah Bara, L'Sheves Yitzhara. Torah insists, to use a Lashon HaKabbalah, that we serve the Eibush in a way of Erev Keli. The light comes into the vessels, which means there's a normalcy to our life. But the normalcy is not a limitation. The normalcy is not a compromise. The normalcy is the investment of the Beli Gavul in Kelim. I heard once that the Tzemach Tzedek said about Rabbi Mendel of Kotzk, Rabbi Nachmendel of Kotzk, the great holy tzaddik of Kotzk, the Soraf of Kotzk, as they call him. Asas Seder for Matan Torah. He lived his life like before Matan Torah. He was an incredible man who raised up so many people to incredible madregas. But it's not Torah. Torah is Adam in the world. And Torah is Adam in the world, not that therefore they're less involved in Torah, but because it's brought into the world. By the Ovis did not exist the same way as it exists by us. Even though by the Ovis we are also saying that you have the Lulei, both aspects, how they're close to the world and how they're connected to Atzmos, they're in a Mesiras Nefesh. But by us, because the Eibush gave us the gift of Torah, it made it possible for us to serve Hashem in a tempered way, in a way that's balanced, Eidos Bekalim, so we have the inyan of Mesiras Nefesh, not in a way that we're sacrificing and running away from the world, but we're living within the world itself. So that's how you have, by the Oves, Lulei, the Lamed Vav and the Lamed Yud. What about Amunah? So Amunah is obvious, because Amunah comes from Chidush HaBenefesh. Amunah comes from Pnimis HaNefesh, Pinteliyad. Like it's brought in Chassidus, going back till the Alter Rebbe, and then the Tzemach Tzedek and the later Rebbe, that Yisrael Ma'aminim B'nei Ma'aminim, Jewish people have so much Amunah, that a simple Yid has more Amunah, Mashanilu Chachmei Hamelech Kalahasik. We have Amunah in the Madregas of Elokus that the smartest people who ever lived could never reach intellectually. Because our Amunah is not based on our Seichel, our Amunah is not based on our intellect, our Amunah is based on, like the Lashon HaGemara is B'nei Ma'aminim. Our Amunah is connected to the fact that we have fathers who had Amunah. And this effect that our emunah is connected lahosam la'ela mota aksa the Yisrael. That the Yiddish emunah has to do with Yechidah. Has to do with our connection to Hashem, which is altogether above reason. Which is why a Yid's sense of the Eibishter and his emunah of the Eibishter is not based, so to speak, on the Eibishter of his understanding, but what the Eibishter is by himself, as we call it in our culture, Atzmos. Not Gilui, not the Eibishter Kvayachli is invested in the world, but the Eibishter as he is Farzich, the Eibishter as he is by himself, is the emunah that every Yid has. And that's Li, or Leimetan Aleph. And then there's a mitzvah of Das Alakei Avicha Vavdei B'Leiv of Shalom. You have to understand the Eibishter. And you have to not just understand the Eibishter, which is called Bina, but you have to come to know the Eibishter, which is called Das, like it says in Tanya Perek Gimel. Yitke daite bechezek u'masmoda, v'lei yasiach daite, so that there shouldn't be chasashon the mainish of the Eibishter is real, because you bring the Eibishter into your Das. Das doesn't make you smarter; it makes what you know truer. And our relationship with the Eibishter is true, because we don't only understand them, but we have Das. But the Das that we have, the pashtas, is the Das and the lakus which our mind can understand. So in emunah, there is also this lulei. There's the emunah atzmis, the emunah yiddish to the Eibishter, which is beyond everything, and how that comes down into havana vasaga and into das, and the way it comes down to havana vasaga and into das, that's the limit tavov. And of course, as it says in Alter Rebbe's letter, which he wrote to Avram Kalisker, Ishta mitzeh, you forgot the Gemara in Masech the Brachas and the Yisrael Day in Yankiv, that gan v'apum machtata rachamona kadiyah. It's not enough to have amun in a way of makif, but you have to bring amun into havana vasaga, which is why the first mitzvah is leida. The first mitzvah is not to be maimin, like people misunderstand the Sefer HaMitzvahs, but the first mitzvah, amun is before mitzvahs, like it says in the Bahag. Because if you already believe in the Eibishter, you cannot be commanded to believe in him. If you don't believe in the Eibishter, it doesn't help to be commanded to believe in him, because you don't believe in him, that you should believe in him. So the first mitzvah is not to believe, the first mitzvah is to know. And the reason you have to know is because only when you know do you internalize. You believe in the Eibishter, and you know he's there. When you have a problem, you daven to him, but you don't listen to him when it gets too difficult. But you know the Eibishter, when you internalize him, when you bring him to havana vasaga, if it comes before emunah, that's not good. Yeah? If it comes after emunah, it's fortifying the faith. The internalization of the Eibishter in our mind makes our faith in the kind of way that even when the Eibishter tells us something which is very expensive for us, on whatever level, physically, emotionally, financially, psychologically, morally, egotistically, we put aside batal etzenech of because the Eibishter is emes. Not just on a level of emunah, which is makif, but a level of chabad, which is pnimius. So in the end of emunah, you also have the lulei, the emunah, the level which is beyond all limits, and the emunah as it comes down to havana vasaga. But when talking about this, I want to add one more idea. And that is that the Rebbe spoke about this in the Hadin and the Tafshin Memvov. Chavav Aderishin Tafshin Memvov. Erev Chav Zayin Aderishin Tafshin Memvov, when we start to learn the Rambam for the third time. That there's emunah before seichel and there's emunah after seichel. And of course you had the members in Tzemach Tzedek as well. First you have emunah like a child. And then you grow in that emunah, you internalize that faith. You bring it to havana vasaga, and then there's the emunah which is beyond it. And bepashtus, the emunah which is beyond the seichel is deeper and hard than the emunah which is before the seichel, because the emunah which is before the seichel is katnas, it's immature, it's childish, it's undeveloped, and the emunah which is after the havana vasaga is so much richer and bigger. But the Rebbe says any type you have emunah, which is even indirectly connected to the human mind, it's limited. And when you have emunah which has nothing to do with the human mind, even if it's the mind of a child, that's pure emunah, that's totally unadulterated. And on that basis, the Rebbe argues that the emunah that the child has before havana vasaga will always be higher and deeper, ultimately, not only than the das and the havana which comes after, but even the emunah which follows. So this is the lulei when it comes to the yin of emunah. The shadish of emunah, by a yid, comes to the chidish of a nefesh, the yud. But then it comes on into das, and always the simple emunah which preceded the das is going to be higher and more absolute than what's going to come from our das. And then we get the Teda. And again, it's the same principle. Teda is Shashuay Malach Batzmusei. Teda is above Seichel. Teda is the Eibishter's Tainuk. Like we all know the stories, the mice with the Arizal and the Beis Yosef, that Torah be'etzem is completely beyond human understanding. But the Eibishter gave us a special matana, hishlich mishamayim eres teferes Yisrael, that we should be able to understand it at least a little bit. And the bringing down of Torah, of Anavasaga, this is bringing down Torah into the world of Atzilus and the lower worlds. But then there's Torah, which is in Sheda Shemaka, which is in Atzmos, which is the unit of Lule mit a Yud and Lule mit an Aleph, mit a Vav. Lule with a Yud is the way the Torah is one with the Eibishter of all limitations. And that's Arucha Meretz Midirachav Miniyam, it's called Taimei Torah, it's called Ne'em Havai, and all kinds of exalted names. Vaya Etzlei Omun. Shashuim. Torah is part of Atzmos Amus. And then you have the Torah as it comes down and the person is being able to understand it. And here also, by the way, you could say the same triad that you said about Amunah, that the end of Limud HaTorah is Kiyum HaMitzvahs, the end of learning Torah is doing mitzvahs. And you're doing a mitzvah, which comes after learning Torah, which is the Vanavasaga, the doing the mitzvah in action, which comes after the learning, which is lower than the Madreg of Taimei Torah, goes back to the Shedish of Mukkah. In other words, the action of the mitzvah doesn't only relate to the level of Torah which taught us how to do that action, which is Torah the way it is in Havana Vasaga. It goes back to the Ratzon HaElyon, which is connected to Atzmos Amhus. And over here, it's the other way around. Here, the final action, the Seif Maisa Machshava Tchila, is not only higher than the Torah, which is the Madreg of Havana Vasaga, it's even higher than Torah, which is the Madreg of Shashua Melech Batzmusei. Because this is the Kavon of the Eibishter being materialized and realized. So the Tzemach brings, so from the Medrash, that the word Lule is connected to Avos, and to Emunah, and to Torah. And in each one of the three, he makes the point I just made, that it's the idea that it begins in Atzmos and it comes on into Seder Ishtalshalos. And that's the Pshat, Lule L'Shem Shahayalonu. Lule L'Shem Shahayalonu B'kum Alenu Adam. That we go into Golus, we survive Golus, and we celebrate our coming out of Golus, and elevating the Golus itself, because we had the koyach of Lule. And not Stamaz the koyach of Lule, not just the koyach of Lule by itself, how the Lule comes on in Havaya, and Havaya comes on into Lanu, very similar to the Anyin of Nech Hashem Alekecha, the way it's explained in Chassidus, these three Madregas. And that's the Dik of Lule. And I wanted to give a class on Lule before we start the Kapital inside, because I wanted to give it its own space. Because it's a foundational idea in this Perek. This Perek is about surviving Golus. But not desperately surviving Golus, celebrating surviving Golus. Even in the middle of Golus, you're celebrating surviving Golus. We don't only survive the Golus, we conquer the Golus. We take the Golus and make it into Geula, which makes the Golus even higher than Geula itself. And the koyach to get through this comes from Noyem and Yisrael, Yankov Avinu, who's the Av of Golus. We have all the three of us. Yankov represents going into Golus, like it says in the Sichos. The Davka Yankov Avinu, who spent his life in Golus and bore his children outside of Eretz Yisrael, is Mitase Shleime. All of his children were tzaddikim, Davka, because they were raised in Golus, because of the Mesiras Nefesh. And he's the one who says, Yemen na Yisrael, he says the 15 Shir Amalas. But it's in this of the 15 Shir Amalas where this expression, Yemen na Yisrael, appears, because it's this Perek. And the Lulia, the Shem Shahayalonu, which got Yankov Vina through the Golus and gets us through the Golus in such a way that we actually benefit from the Golus itself. That's the first idea that I wanted to talk about in this class. And then you have three Azais, Azai. The third Pasuk, the fourth Pasuk, and the fifth Pasuk. The whole Kapital is 8 Pasukim. Azai Chayim Beluna B'Chareis Apam Banu. Azai Amayim Shtafun Nachal Over. Avshir Azai Over Amashenu Amayim Azedenim. And I think Rabbi Yosef Chiyun connects these three psukim to Golus Mitzrayim, and to Golus Bovel, and to Golus Edom. The first pasuk, Azai Chayim Beluna B'Chareis Apam Banu, goes to Golus Mitzrayim. Azai Hamayim Shtafunu Nachla Avra L'Shen, goes on Golus Bovel. And Azai Avra L'Shen Amayim Azedenim goes on our final Golus. And he goes on to say, Baruch Hashem Shloim Nisnor Teref L'Shineim is the survival of Golus Mitzrayim. Navshenu Ketzipa Nimla Tomi Pach Yekshem is the survival of Golus Bavel. And Apach Nishba Vanachnu Nimlotnu, as they touched there, is the survival of the final Golus. Our Golus in which we're in, because that's where the Pach is Nishba, there's no more Golus. Can't be any more Goliaths. But I want to translate the word azay. Azay chaim beluna b'chas ha'pavon. Azay amayim shtafun nachla over l'shenu. Azay over l'shenu mayim azedenim. 3 times. Just like you have 2 psukim in the positive, say lula, you have 3 psukim in the negative, say azay. The problem is I never saw any place in Chassidus that has the word azay. The word oz there is a lot, like oz yasher meisha, oz yasher yisrael, and so on. But what is oz with a yud? Azay. So to me, the azay with a yud is like the luli with a yud rather than the lili with an aleph. So this, I'm making this up. Okay, I'm saying a pshat. I'm saying a pshetl. And that's all it is. It's a drush. That azay is 8. Like I said in Shal Chuvas HaRashba, that's famous in Brot Namarim of Shmini, which is of course going to be the Pasha, the Chitas, and the Pasha of Pesach. It's Pasha Shmini, Vahi B'yem HaShmini, and Chassidus brings from the Klei Yakar, the Inyan from Aleph Rechav Al Zayin. And the Klei Yakar quotes the Shal Chuvas HaRashba, that 7 is Hekef, 2nd represents Seder Ishtashlus, and 8 is Shemer Hekef, it's above Seder Ishtashlus. And there's a whole bunch of Chassidus on the number 8, based on this. So Oz goes on 8, 1 more than 7. And 1 more than 7 goes on godliness, which is above Ishtalshalos. And then you have the Yud. And there's 2 ways to read that Yud. You could read that Yud as a Mailam master over the Oz. And you could read that Yud as a Maila, as raising up to an even higher Madrega, the Oz as the Oz is by itself. How would you explain it the first way? Oz is godliness which is above Ishtalshalos. Godliness which is above Ishtalshalos is greater than godliness of Ishtalshalos, but it's removed from Ishtalshalos. And the Yud connotes that it's hidden, that the world doesn't have it. It's like the Indian of the Kudetach Sayesait. Up there, the godliness is so great that down here we have no experience of what it is. So there is a very high level of godliness. And the closest, the Madrega of Aleph, as we talked about, godliness, where the Abish's preference for Yidden, as opposed to Klippa, is not on a level of worthiness and reason and logic, but it's a choice. Lahosam le'elo, mota aksa di Yisrael, it's an absolute decision. The Abisha says, and without avoida, the Yud means that this is not revealed. Like it says in Chassidus, in times of Golus, the relationship between Hashem and the world is only from Atika Kaddish. Because the relationship with Zoh went away, but the relationship with Atika Kaddish is hidden, you don't see it. It's at such moments you see it. Otherwise the Yud covers over the Yuz. And that's one way of explaining the Azai, that in the times of Golus, the relationship between Yid and the Eibishter is not on a limited level, not on a Ishtashlus level. It's only on above Ishtashlus level, as represented by the Aleph and the Zayin together. And the Yud covers it over. So although in some ways, in the times of Golus, Hashem's connection to the Yid is coming from a higher place, practically in the human experience, in the times of Golus, Hashem is hidden from us. So although he's relating to us from a higher level, as far as we're concerned, he's concealed. But then you have the Avodah of Yid in Golus. And the Avodah of Yid in Golus is Mesiras Nefesh Kiddush Hashem. The Avodah of Yid in Golus is to take Emunah and bring it from a state of Emunah, which is Katnes, to Emunah Zu Ki Rabba, which is godless. And then, of course, in Limud HaTeira is to be Makasha the Teira with the Nesen HaTeira. Baruch Hu HaTeira Tchelu with Pnimius HaTeira, the Kaf Chumtin, with the Elokus of Teira. And when you do that, the Yud, instead of being the Mailum Umasted over the Oz, that the connection between Hashem and the world, the connection between Hashem and Yidden, which is Madrega above Ishtashlus, is hidden by the Yud. The Yud represents bringing it into Seder Ishtashlus, because the Yud is Bittel. The Yud is Bittel. Yud is Yud Ekev, the heel. Yankev is Yud Ekev. Ekev is the lowest level. Yud is the highest level, because in the heel, in the Bittel, you have Atmos of Elokus. And I'm suggesting that the Azai, the Yud is like the Yud of Lule, as the Rebbe explains, how the Yud of Lule is higher than the Aleph, Loi Matan Aleph. It's godliness which is not completely removed from Seder Ishtashlus. It's godliness which is removed from Seder Ishtashlus that's not even invested in Seder Ishtashlus in a way of Pnimius Abba, Pnimius Atik by the Eibish's choice, Klayachol. So those are the two Azais. The first Azai is that it allows for the Tzaris, because the Yud is covering over the Azai. That's why you have Chayim Beluna, Bachayis Apambanu, Hamayim Shtafu, Nacha, Avar Lashenu, Avar Lashayim, Mayim Azedenim. But that same Azai also preserves. That same Azai through our Mesiras Nefesh, through our Emunah, and through our limud Torah and our connection to the Nesan Torah, bring into the world, even in the times of Golus, godliness which is above Ishtalshlus, and therefore there isn't the Chayim Balonu, and there isn't the Bechares Apambanu, and there isn't the Hamayim Shtafun, and there isn't the Nachla Avad al Nashenu, and there isn't the Avad al Nashenu Hamayim Zidenu. As we'll see in the Shurim, we're going to learn Mitzvah on the Perek. And this is my thought on the word Azai. And I think it goes very well, the Oz with the Yud goes very well with the Lule. The way the Rebbe explained that the Yud of Lule is actually higher than the Lule when the Lule is spelled Lamed Vav, Lamed Aleph. Now this shir is almost an hour old. It's time to stop. In the Mitzvah Hashem, in the next shir, we're going to start reading the Kapital inside. But I do want to repeat what I said at the end of the first shir, the last shir, which was literally half the length of this one. That in the Sefer Pirush of Tim for Beisef Chiyun, I don't know who he was, but he's from the early Achreinim. He connects the three Azais to the three Golias, Golos Mitzayim, Golos Bovel, and Golos Edom. The Alshich connects the whole Kapital in a much more complicated way. The first pasuk, Luli Ad Hashem Shahayolanu Yemanei Yisrael, goes on Churban Bayis Rishon and going into Golos. He brings that going into Golos actually saved us. Because Tam's Chusovis, we no longer had this Chusovis, and Eibishter preserved us and did not allow us to become destroyed by sending it into Golos 12 years before the time, not 2 years, but Yud Beis Shonim, whatever the Cheshbonis are. Then the Luli Adeshem Shahayolana B'Kumalenu Adam goes on Haman, and he's medayik that Haman is about Bechira. We'll talk about it in the Shiyurim. I don't know if I'm going to talk about Haman, but I'm going to talk about Adam. He argues that Haman was a medayik of Adam, which is higher than Ish, and higher than Gever, and higher than Enish. And Haman was Klippa. And that's why he was such a big sakana. And because of Luli Hashem Shayalanu, we were able to overcome B'Kumalenu. But he says these two Golias, Golus Bavel and Golus Madai, were Shmadis. They wanted to kill us. Then you have in the fifth pasuk, Azai Avad al Nafshenu, the diak on the word Nefesh as opposed to the word Guf, is Chanukah. It's Golos Yovan. That the attack is not against the body of the Jewish people, it's against the neshama of the Jewish people. And because of the Keach of Lulei, we were able to fortify our neshama and to have the necessary Mesiras Nefesh to win that battle, that Mulchama. And finally, according to this also, the very last pasuk, Zenu, B'Shem Hashem Eisei Shemayim V'Aretz, is also against Nachla Ovar al Nafshenu, that in this, the final Golus, it's not a war so much against the Jewish body, as were Golus Bovel and Golus Madai, but against the Yiddish and Neshama, as was and is Golus Yavon. And we got through that Golus through a great act of Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, u'kafi she'ez b'ay l'kam nemitz Hashem. And tomorrow I'll begin to read the Kapital inside.